Hello and welcome to Thursday's interview here on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond. And this week I'm delighted to tell you we are celebrating all things Egypt. And as you can probably tell from Isis behind me, I just love ancient Egypt. I'm fascinated by its art, its culture, and of course those stories of discovery, particularly the finding of Tutankhamun's tomb almost exactly 100 years ago. In fact, to mark that extraordinary anniversary, Viking has christened its new Nile River cruise ship the Viking Osiris, with this time a godfather rather than a godmother. He is the present Lord Carnarvon, and there he is with Lady Carnarvon in front of a very recognisable Highclere Castle there. They are, of course, great friends of Viking.TV. But Lord Carnarvon there is the 8th Earl. He is the great-grandson of the very same Lord Carnarvon, the 5th Earl, who with Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb with its fantastic treasures on that hot and dusty Saturday in the Valley of the Kings, 4th of November, 1922. There they are, I think, with Lord Carnarvon's daughter as well, who had just gone out there. That discovery sparked what they called at the time Tutmania, a surge of interest in all things about King Tut and all things ancient Egyptian. That's why Agatha Christie set some of her best detective novels there. And of course, it all fed a whole new interest in tourism for the region, a thirst for knowledge and exploration that hasn't died since. Well, to coincide with such a huge anniversary, here in Britain, a huge exhibition has been created called Visions of Ancient Egypt. It's opening at the Sainsbury Centre this month, right through to early next year, and will explore the enduring appeal of Egypt in art and design from the ancient past to the present day. The exhibition will feature over 150 works drawn from collections in the UK and internationally, and will examine how ancient Egypt has shaped our cultural imagination. So now, please, meet someone who can tell us so very much more about it. She is the Deputy Director of the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts, Ghislaine Wood. Hello and welcome.
Hello, Anne. Yes, I'm very pleased to be here.
It's an exciting subject. It couldn't be more exciting for me. I absolutely love what you've been spending how long getting ready for?
Well, it's been several years in the making. There are two marvellous young curators of this show who've been working on it for a very long time. One's an expert in Egyptology, and the other is a design and art historian. So they've actually put the show together, but I've worked as the consultant curator because I've worked on sort of subject matter related to the discovery of the tomb, sort of the interwar period, for many, many years. So I'm really excited that this show is opening with us here at the Sainsbury Centre in early September.
Can you explain why people like me, why so many of us all over the world are still so fascinated, particularly by ancient Egypt?
Well, that's a very good starting question. I mean, it is extraordinary, the sort of enduring appeal of ancient Egypt. And of course, this is not a new phenomenon. It goes right back into the classical world. And this is what this exhibition actually traces, this incredible sort of enduring appeal of ancient Egypt that comes right up to the contemporary. And I think it can be attributed to very many things. Egypt has come to mean it has a myriad of different meanings for different people across time and across cultures, and this is really what the show is exploring. Of course, we're fascinated with sort of ancient Egypt, sort of ritual, and the material culture of ancient Egypt, the incredible sort of architecture and archaeological sites that still survive in Egypt. But I think it's come to mean so much more in Western culture. It's been reinvented as this great exotic sort of a centre, and then, you know, much more recently it's come to sort of represent ideas of the modern. You know, we can think of sort of factories built in the interwar period that were built in the Egyptian style. You know, the Carreras cigarette factory in Camden Town in London, for instance. There are many buildings across the country, but I think what this show does, which is so new and so important, is it provides a counterbalance to that. It looks at actually how ancient Egypt influenced Egypt itself and the Islamic world that came after Egypt. So this show is important for that. It's not just about the Western sort of imagination and how we've structured ideas and fantasies of Egypt, but also how Egypt itself looked at ancient Egypt and how it became important for ideas of Egyptian nationalism, for instance, in the interwar period.
I mean, I suppose it keeps feeding our imagination, because at the moment, in this century at least, and the last, we're still uncovering new discoveries, things that we didn't even know existed, or amazing works of art. They're still finding them in the sand.
Well, that's it. It's incredible, isn't it, that there's just such a rich material culture in Egypt, that the discoveries can still be found, and that just really speaks to what a rich ancient culture and world it was. And of course, you know, human habitation in Egypt, you know, the Nile Valley was one of the sort of centres of sort of, you know, the development of sort of human society. So it is such a fascinating region. And wonderful that you can still go and discover new sites and discover new knowledge.
Well, we'll talk a bit more about Tutankhamun later, but the 4th of November, of course, is going to mark that amazing anniversary. And it's a very significant date, obviously, for the exhibition, isn't it?
It is. We've sort of staged this show now because there are actually 2 very, very important anniversaries this year, and it makes it a very sort of appropriate moment to really look back at the impact of ancient Egypt on sort of art, design and culture. And those anniversaries are very important in the history of Egyptology and the study of Egypt. Of course, it's 200 years since the decipherment of hieroglyphics and Champollion's discovery of the meaning of hieroglyphics, and 100 years since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. So we've got these 2 remarkable moments to mark with this exhibition, and really they are the moments that sort of, you know, frame sort of Western approaches to Egypt and the Western sort of consumption of Egypt.
I didn't understand. I didn't realise that it was 200 years since the discovery of the hieroglyphics, or the understanding of those hieroglyphics. I mean, that must have been a monumental breakthrough.
It was. Yes, Jean-Francois Champollion's discovery of the meaning of hieroglyphics really changed the way that Egypt was perceived and the way that Egypt was understood. I mean, obviously then there could be you know, an in-depth study of history and you know, of its sort of cultural importance. So yeah, very, very significant. And of course, that is the, you know, the Rosetta Stone sits in the British Museum, which was the you know, that enabled the decipherment of hieroglyphics.
Yeah, it was the key, wasn't it? The key to the code. Cleopatra. Now, there's a name that means something to all of us, I guess, been romanticized and talked about in various different ways. But I understand that for your first section of the exhibition, she's very much the theme. Why did you choose her to start the whole show, as it were?
Well, we chose Cleopatra because she's a very familiar figure to us, isn't she? We've all, hopefully, we might have seen Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, or we certainly have an idea of what we think, who we think Cleopatra is. And all of us can think of the famous, you know, Liz Taylor film of Cleopatra. So she's come to represent all these ideas in the sort of Western imagination: the erotic, the beautiful, the seductress. You know, so she's very familiar to us. So we thought it was quite a good idea to sort of start with her and then unpack the many, many meanings of Cleopatra and the way that she's come to represent different things at different times and to different people. I mean, actually, in the Islamic world, Cleopatra was seen as a scholar, you know, a linguist. She spoke many languages, but she was actually the first ruler, Ptolemaic ruler, to learn Egyptian. So she was perceived as a great scholar and sort of heroine in the Islamic world. Of course, after the Roman conquest of Egypt, and Rome frames her really as a sort of seductress and a temptress, and violent, and that's really the Cleopatra that's come down to us in sort of, you know, in the West. That idea of Cleopatra as sort of disrupting, you know, the male Roman sphere. Of course, it's quite a misogynistic view, the Roman view of Cleopatra. So really what we wanted to do was take these different Cleopatras from different moments in time and sort of unpack her for the audience and show how ancient Egypt could be constructed to mean different things at different political moments. And I think this show is also important in the sense that it looks at Egypt as a contested space, a space that was fought over by the different colonial powers, and therefore it was sort of put at the agency of different, sort of powers at different times. So Cleopatra helps us sort of unpack that right at the beginning of the show. And we also get to start with some fantastic objects. We've got a fantastic Joshua Reynolds painting of the courtesan, Kitty Fisher, depicting herself as Cleopatra. But alongside that, we've got Chris Ophelia sort of depiction as a black queen, the Black Cleopatra, and that was one of his Royal College of Art, graduation work. So we've got all these different views of Cleopatra in that first gallery.
Yes, I found that fascinating. One of the first times I ever went to Egypt, to find myself being guided by a brilliant tour guide who was she was a woman and she was a Muslim, and yet she had a very, very deep understanding. And it actually brought it home to me that since those days of ancient Egypt, Egypt's gone through an awful lot since, and different cultures have inherited its history.
That's right, and very classical, very, very important in the classical world. How Egypt is sort of, brought to Rome. The material culture of Egypt is brought to Rome. Obelisks arrive in ancient Rome, but it's divorced from any knowledge of the culture itself. So it's sort of invented in the classical, in classical Rome, and then comes down to us into the Renaissance, via the Roman sort of conduits. But yes, of course, what the show aims to do is to introduce this sort of wider knowledge. So looking at Arabic texts, medieval Arabic texts, and what Egypt came to mean in the Islamic world in these earlier periods, alongside what's happening in the West. But it's a complex story. But we're really sort of excited to be able to try and tell this much more multifaceted story of Egypt in the exhibition.
Yeah, and she was somebody who's known to most of the world, I guess. But how much do we know of the real person? I mean, she was a real person, wasn't she? That's very well documented. Was she young and beautiful, or older and more powerful?
Well, of course it is. She's a fascinating historical figure, Cleopatra, and we do know, a fair amount about her, in the sense that we know she was a Macedonian. Macedonian royal family and a Ptolemy, and she was the last ruler of Egypt. So she marks this incredibly important moment where she's the last sort of pharaoh, and before the Romans sort of subsuming of Egypt and taking control. So that's why she's such a sort of contentious figure. She's a sort of nexus figure for this sort of transition in Egypt. But yes, we do know a fair amount about her. She did have a relationship with Antony, and she did have Caesar's child. So she was an important dynastic figure. But what we also know from the Islamic world is that she was a scholar, and she was known as a scholar, and actually she fostered this sense of sort of a cultivated culture in Egypt, and it is thought she might have built, a library at Alexandria as well. So she had this sort of wider sort of impact that we're perhaps not so aware of in the West.
Actually, educated and very intelligent and powerful women weren't that unusual in ancient Egypt. There have been a few, haven't there? There have. I mean, yes, of course, pharaohs could be women, like Hatshepsut, who was a great female pharaoh. So yes, more unusual in the Roman world, and I think that's the interesting thing, that we find Cleopatra extraordinary because of the fact that later there aren't great sort of female leaders. Yes, and actually the show looks at Nefertiti. So we do end, if we start the show with Cleopatra, we sort of end the show with Nefertiti and what Nefertiti's come to mean for different cultures and at different times. But on to a male figure who probably is the most world-famous ancient Egyptian, King Tutankhamun. The discovery of his tomb. How significant was this, not only from a historical and archaeological perspective, but also the whole everything that's happened since, really, Tutmania, as I called it earlier? Yes, well, it was extraordinary. It was an explosion of interest in Egypt in the 1920s after the discovery of the tomb. But I think this show also aims to put that in context. Of course, there have been other moments where Egypt sort of exploded into the Western sort of imagination. For instance, the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, when he took his savants, his scholars, to Egypt en masse. Over 100
scholars, 150 scholars, went to Egypt to sort of document it. And of course, that precipitated a great moment, of sort of the consumption of Egyptian design and style in the West, particularly in France, and then across the rest of Europe. So there have been these moments, but there's no doubt that the discovery of an almost intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1922 is a whole other scale of sort of consumption of Egypt. And I think that's really helped by new mediums, things like photography. So of course, Harriet Burton was able to document the objects coming out of the tomb, and there was this sort of almost sort of reality TV, almost sort of consumption of it, where the photographs would be published day by day or week by week as objects were removed from the tomb, and so people could kind of follow the story. It was a story that people could sort of get excited about and follow along, looking at these incredible images, these staged images that made transparent all the incredible riches of the tomb. So yes, it was amazing. But I suppose what's so also amazing about that moment is that you've got the right conditions for the worldwide, the global spread of the interest in Tutankhamun. You've got sort of ways of disseminating information that you probably didn't have in earlier periods. So therefore you can see the influence of ancient Egypt in sort of buildings from everywhere, from sort of Rio to New York to Shanghai. Yeah, so it's remarkable, and affecting every area of design as well. So not only high-end objects, which we have in the exhibition, fantastic examples of jewelry and fashion, but getting right down to things that everyday things that people could buy, sort of things in new materials like plastics, biscuit tins, sort of tea towels. The whole range of sort of contemporary design was affected by the influence the influence of Tut.
So you said earlier that you a good 150 various items. How do you choose them? Where do you start? From which collections? Or I guess, do you always know, oh, I'd like to get my hands on one of those or a bit of that? Do you start the talks for many years ago? Is that how it works?
Yes, well, the curators have been working on the show for several years, and they've done a huge amount of sort of research, visiting different collections around the world and trying to find the best examples of objects. And it's a sort of a process of sort of gathering information. We sort of start with a big canvas and sort of try and sort of assemble a very long object list that would include a lot of material, and then we kind of whittle it down eventually to something that's more structured and that's more sort of focused. But yes, I mean, there are remarkable things in the exhibition, and they're things that you want. So you want the great examples of sort of late 19th century painting, and we wanted wonderful examples of furniture. Equally, we wanted to represent the impact on fashion in the 20s and 30s, which is something that people really love, and still, there's still a great appetite for sort of Art Deco. So there are things that we know we want, but then also there are things that come out of the woodwork, and that's the lovely thing about these projects. And in fact, for this exhibition, we did something which was a bit unusual. We did a call in a trade magazine called the Antiques Trade Gazette, and we actually put out an advert saying, have you got any Egyptian influenced, Egyptian style works? If you have, then the Sainsbury's Centre in Norwich would be delighted to hear from you. So some wonderful things came via sort of an open call, because we know that lots of people love Egypt, collect Egypt. So that resulted in wonderful things coming in. But the context of the Sainsbury's Centre also enables us to focus a bit more on fine art and on painting and sculpture. So the show does have a lot of sort of contemporary art in it as well. And equally, this show wanted to include, as I said, what's happening in Egypt and how contemporary Egyptians think about their ancient pharaonic past and what it means to them. So we've got quite a lot of work by contemporary Egyptian artists in the show.
Is the idea when you put on a show like this, the sheer fact that we're calling it a show, I suppose, instead of an exhibition, although it's that as well, is the idea to tell a story, to pull people in and interest them more and more and try and tell a story, to unweave a story?
It is. I think all exhibitions do tell a story. Here we've got an incredibly rich and complex story with how the West has sort of appropriated and used Egypt over time. And of course, these are controversial questions. Just recently there's been press around Howard Carter's role in sort of the discovery of the tomb and whether objects left Egypt illegally. So it's still a very contentious issue, and we didn't want to shy away from those issues in the exhibition. So we have included quite a lot of material around 20th century practices, or 19th and 20th century practices of sort of Egyptology. But yes, we do try and tell a story. How we tend to work is we create sort of thematic sections. So each section of the exhibition will explore, a particular theme. In fact, this exhibition does roughly follow a chronology. So although we start with Cleopatra as a kind of an indication of the ways that ancient Egypt can be sort of, how its meanings can be changed over time or appropriated over time, then the show does go more into a sort of chronological run where we look at the way that what Egypt's come to mean in different times.
Yeah, and designing an exhibition for such an incredible space, that must be a whole new thing, because the space that you're doing it in, Sainsbury Centre, is amazing. Can you tell us a bit more about it? The whole background of the Sainsbury Centre, how it came to be. I mean, just look at the setting for it for a start. It's an incredible thing on its own, let alone what's inside it. So who were the Sainsburys? Why did they decide to create this incredible museum space in Norwich?
Well, it is an amazing story, the Sainsbury story. So this is Robert and Lisa Sainsbury, of course, of Sainsbury's supermarket fame. And they had amassed from the 1930s an absolutely extraordinary private collection. They were interested, they had very Catholic tastes, and they were interested in works from across cultures and across time. So they didn't just collect contemporary art, they also collected objects from around the world, and going right back into the ancient world. And I think essentially the collection sort of outgrew their house in London, in Smith Square in London, and they were looking for a home for it. And in fact, they offered the collection to Cambridge University, but Cambridge wanted to split it up into its constituent parts. So they wanted to put the sort of anthropological objects in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and they wanted to put the Western sort of art, in the Fitzwilliam. And the Sainsburys didn't want that. They wanted to keep it as a complete collection. So rather fortuitously, Lisa Sainsbury was sitting next to the Vice Chancellor of the new university, the University of East Anglia, which of course was a 60s university designed by the fantastic Dennis Lasdon. It's one of Lasdon's great, concrete masterpieces. And the Vice Chancellor said, well, we would be very happy to receive the collection. And of course, you can have a building for it, and you can choose where that building is located on our new campus. So the Sainsburys then, incredibly with great foresight, selected a young architect who hadn't built a huge number of buildings, called Norman Foster. And the Sainsbury Centre is Norman Foster's first public building. And of course, it represents lots of the sort of principles that Foster has then sort of carried on in innumerable other buildings around the world. And of course, he's, arguably the most famous and important architect, currently alive.
It was a very
great building.
Yeah, it's very brave building for him to make his first. I suppose he had to make his mark. But a lot of people might look at it and say, it's just a great big aircraft hangar. And it has been described, hasn't it, as more Boeing than Bauhaus?
It has, and it is a giant shed. It's a giant steel space frame building that houses the collection. And also it was very progressive in the way it thought about collections and teaching spaces. So we actually have teaching spaces in the building as well. It's multifunctional, alongside lovely restaurants and shops and the collection. We also have the art history department. We have the Sainsbury Research Unit, which studies archaeology and anthropology. So it's a study space as well as a public museum. So very progressive for 1978 when it opened. And you've got to remember, this is, the year, within a year, we had the George Pompidou Centre as well, changing the paradigm of the modern museum. So the Sainsbury Centre and the Pompidou Centre, which of course was designed by Foster's great friend Richard Rogers, are really changing the nature of museums in the late 70s. But it is a remarkable space, and it is challenging because it is this great open shed-like, a space. But Sainsbury's and Foster and indeed a number of the artists who are included in the collection work very, very closely on the displays here. So although it's a big space, it feels very intimate. We're one of the only museums in the world to have carpet, which you can see in that image. We have carpet. because the Sainsbury's wanted it to emulate their house in London, Smith Square in London, which of course was a domestic space. And a lot of the scale of the objects that Sainsbury's collected were sort of domestic scale, things that they could fit into their house. So it does have a very, very different feel from almost any other museum in the world, and that makes it really remarkable. I mean, I should add that we do have purpose-built temporary exhibition spaces downstairs, which is where the Visions of Ancient Egypt exhibition will be. So they'll be in their own sort of dedicated exhibition spaces. But the living area, what we call the living area upstairs, which is where the majority of the Sainsbury collection is held, it is really remarkable because there's also very little text. So what the Sainsbury's wanted you to do was to look at art from across time and across cultures with you know, a certain equality. So they didn't make a distinction between African art or Oceanic art and, you know, the works of Francis Bacon or Alberto Giacometti. So you're encouraged to look at all art and to think, yes, you know, there is an equality of treatment here, and there is a sort of, you know, the human input, the human creativity that goes into these works from across time and across cultures is equally important. So it is a remarkable space, and it really did change the way people looked at collections.
I think that's rather lovely in a way, that they stipulated that it should be almost shown off in the way they would have done at home, because surely one of the great pleasures of being that rich must be to sort of say, I know what I like. I don't have to explain it to anyone. I don't have to curate it in certain ways. I just like to show off what I want and what makes me feel good. And I think the idea of a carpet is fantastic. Though you must take a lot of cleaning.
It does take a lot of cleaning. It does. We have a fantastic team responsible for the care of the collections and the building. Yes, and the Sainsbury's, I mean, the interesting thing about, of course, they were very wealthy, the Sainsbury's, but they set themselves a budget. So the very interesting thing about the Sainsbury collection is that they had a yearly budget, and they didn't go over that budget, which I think at one point was about £1,000, so not a huge budget. And they would sell things to then be able to buy other things. So they were very strict about what they collected. But what is remarkable is their sort of support for contemporary artists that then just, you know, was shown to be sort of prescient, in the sense that, you know, they supported Francis Bacon before he had any sort of patrons and before he was a successful artist, and Robert Sainsbury underwrote his overdraft and acquired lots of his early work. So we have one of the biggest Francis Bacon collections anywhere in the world here at the centre. So they, you know, they were really quite visionary. And again, that's true with Henry Moore. Henry Moore was the godfather of our current patron, David Sainsbury, who still, you know, and the Gatsby Foundation is still very supportive of the centre. You know, Henry, you know, incredibly close relationship with Henry Moore and the Sainsbury's, and he placed his works here, and we have a large collection of his work, and Alberto Giacometti as well. So they really, you know, they really knew what they liked, and they stuck to it, and they weren't swayed necessarily by sort of wider fashions. So yes, you know, they had an eye. They had an eye.
Yeah. Oh, clearly had an eye, but as you said, they knew what they liked. It must be fun as well. I mean, as you said, you used the word challenge, having such an enormous space to be able to work with. That's one of the challenges. But the other thing must be lovely, that you are outside London, because I know in the art world particularly, a lot of people get very fed up with this total concentration on the capital. It must be true of other countries too. But you're not in London, but now you've made it something worth seeing outside London.
Yes, I mean, of course, you know, we're lucky in this country that we have incredibly rich regional collections right across the country. And yes, I think there has been a bit of a reaction against the sort of metropolitanism that, you know, so much funding and so much focus has been on the London institutions. And in fact, there is this, you know, this much wider, richer sort of culture that does need support. And you know, it is difficult. We're obviously in Norwich, which is the centre of East Anglia, but it's a, you know, largely sort of rural area. So we do what we can to sort of encourage people to come out of London, come to Norwich. It's a fantastic city. It's got an incredible sort of medieval centre, beautiful cathedral, wonderful local authority museum as well. And to encourage people to come and visit us. So I think things are changing, but it has been challenging. It has been challenging in the past, and equally here, of course, we also have the fact that people rush up to the coast. We've got beautiful coastlines here, beautiful sort of landscape, and it's only a quick nip into Norwich. It's only a quick sort of half an hour in to come and visit us here on our beautiful campus with our sculpture park. We have 350 acres here and a beautiful sculpture park. So we're really hopeful that this show will encourage people to come and visit us.
I love
and visit the park.
I absolutely love these outdoor works of art that you can just be walking around and suddenly come across something that has such enormous impact. And so there's, as you were saying, it's a day out, not just to see the exhibition we're talking about at the moment, but there's so much more to see there for you to literally have a day out. It's an event, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, you could come to that campus and spend the day. We've got a wonderful sculpture park, we've got wonderful permanent collections and the exhibition spaces, and of course we're in a lovely landscape. So
this picture here, you'll have to tell me about now. What is that? I love it, and I don't know why I love it.
That's Elizabeth Frink, actually, the great Elizabeth Frink. We were very lucky to get a large bequest of her work, and we did a major show of hers a few years ago. And we were lucky that two pieces came to us. Those two, they're called the Mirage Birds, came to us, and they're now permanently in our sculpture park. And actually, at that point, Liz Frink was living in the south of France, and she'd sort of see heat waves, and she'd see birds, in the heat wave. That would sort of disrupt their form and their sort of silhouette. So actually these works were evocative of her living in France and seeing birds across across the landscape. So we've positioned them next to our wonderful lake here, so they look absolutely amazing. But she was a very significant post-war British artist, and of course that is one of the strengths of our collection is it's British art and British sculpture. Henry Moore, Lynn Chadwick. We've got wonderful Anthony Gormley's.
We've got another one.
Man of Stones is one of the real favourites on the campus. So he's a giant figure by the sculptor Lawrence Edwards, and actually it's a work that was made for that site. So it's an in situ work where Lawrence came and he collected up. It sits between the Broad and the river. And he came and he collected up lots of sort of the sort of vegetation and stones and objects that sit on between those sites, including bulrushes. And then he cast Man of Stones, and he's sort of covered, he's sort of, gowned in this sort of raw material, which was cast from objects from this site. So he really is, a magnificent work on the campus, and he's now dearly loved. There was lots of sort of worries that students might think he was a real figure hiding, in the vegetation. But actually now he's become one of the most popular things on our sculpture park.
Is it life size or is it bigger?
Bigger than life size. Bigger.
Ooh.
In fact, if you approach him paddleboarding up the river, which lots of people do, he looms out of the bank. I mean, he's a monumental sculpture.
And then we got another one, which probably you just come across by accident, but I love that one too. It's gorgeous.
Yes. Well, this is our wonderful rabbit goddess, our Usagi Cannon, by the Japanese artist Leiko Ikemura, who's a major artist. She's very well known in Europe. She's not so well known in Britain, and she's a Japanese artist, but based in Berlin. And any of you who will have visited us in the past will know that we have an extraordinary rabbit colony here. We have the longest studied rabbit colony on the University of East Anglia campus. There are rabbits sort of everywhere. So we thought it was highly appropriate that we had one of Leiko's rabbit goddess sculptures here. She's to sort of, provide a focus for our rabbit colonies and our younger visitors who absolutely love her. Children can go in her skirt, and it's a sort of protective kind of enveloping space. Yeah. So she's another lovely work on the park.
Oh, I love her. How did you get interested in art in the first place, and this sort of way of exhibiting it? I mean, do you come from an artistic family yourself?
Well, I do come from an artistic family. Both my parents were actors, actually, but no, I became very interested in art history. So I'm sort of one of those unusual people who did study art history at university and then for postgrad. But actually, I was very lucky early on to get a job at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I'm actually by training I studied art history, but I then went on into sort of decorative arts and design history because I spent 20 years at the V&A, sort of learning in those absolutely extraordinary collections. So yes, I was always interested in art, but I didn't know that I would end up in sort of design and decorative arts. But that's definitely become, and I'm now sort of, I look at sort of the 20th century really is my area. But yes, I've had a lovely career and very much enjoyed working in museums, and particularly coming to the Sainsbury Centre and outside of London and seeing the perspective of being out of the metropolis. Yeah, so it's I would recommend anyone to think about a career in museums. You'll get a huge amount out of it.
Was that when you were working at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, was that when you first met Viking?
It was. That was the beginning of our relationship. Yes, I curated a very major exhibition called Ocean Liners, Speed and Style, which was a show that we did in 2017. And we were lucky that Viking, it was a match made in heaven, really. Viking came in and supported that exhibition. So this was a sort of an all-encompassing major sort of exploration of the sort of history and material, design of ocean liners. Yes, and that was the beginning of our relationship.
I mean, ocean liners, hopefully, are still enjoying a very golden age, but that the 1920s, 1930s feel of this golden age of the old-fashioned ocean liners, it's absolutely fascinating again, and of course it covers the world again.
It does. And of course companies like Viking, with the wonderful design on board, are continuing, with this great sort of, the lineage of ocean liner design, which has always had extraordinary design. Of course it has to be commercially contingent. You've got to, make sure that your audiences enjoy coming on and have a great time. And that's, that's what Viking has continued with, these wonderful sort of designed spaces. So yes, no, I mean, I'm fascinated by liners. I've always been fascinated by liners. I've been fascinated by the link between sort of artists, working on designers and, and the influence of sort of, the technology of liners on modernism, which was equally strong. So people like Le Corbusier were very influenced by sort of liner technology and the way that can provide a model for sort of contemporary living. So it's the sort of interchange between the worlds of art and design that I'm quite often interested in, and that's equally true for Visions of Ancient Egypt, of course. This interplay and how it affects sort of much wider spheres of design.
Yes, actually, back to this exhibition, we've been talking a lot about ancient Egypt, but you are dealing with some of the contemporary artists as well. What sort of stuff do they do?
Well, contemporary Egyptian artists, of course, we focused on those artists who are looking at their pharaonic past, who are looking at ancient Egypt. Of course, there are many very important Egyptian artists who are not focused on that. But the artists we've included in the shows are artists who really have sort of, interrogated ancient Egyptian sort of forms, but also how they've been appropriated into the West. So we've got Sarah Salam, who's coming to us in November as our artist in resident, and she's going to be looking at the way that sort of the West has created these sort of tropes of ancient Egypt, the mummy, the curse, all of these things that sort of under sort of pin quite a lot of sort of popular culture in the 20th century. And she's really sort of interrogated that in her work. And she's also looked at obviously what it means to her to be a sort of an Egyptian woman, for her ancestry to be sort of ancient Egyptian women. So she's a really interesting artist, and she'll be with us in November and hopefully making new work. And then we have a number of Egyptian artists going right back into the 20s and 30s, when ancient Egypt came to sort of represent a sort of modern national style in Egypt. At a moment of when Egypt is gaining independence, the pharaonic imagery becomes used to sort of represent contemporary Egypt in the 20s and 30s. So we have a number of works in the show that explore that. But then we come right up to the contemporary with people like Chantal Badician and others. So yes, it's very rich, the exhibition.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. Okay, so what's next? I mean, yes, you've got this one to concentrate on. I think I said the exhibition was going right through to the end of January, I think.
Yes, it's with us until January, and then it goes to the Lane Art Gallery in Newcastle, sort of next spring and summer. So it'll be in Newcastle. So if you don't catch it in Norwich, catch it in Newcastle. So it travels on there. And we're really pleased that it's going on. But sadly, these shows come to an end. They are, you've got your moment to see it, and then There may not be another show on this subject matter for a generation or two.
Oh, absolutely. And you kick yourself if you don't see the best things at the right time. What about you? What does this mean that you immediately start work on the next thing, the next big exhibition?
Yes, we've already got a pipeline of shows. So yes, the next exhibition looks at art from the Pacific Northwest coast, so the northwest coast of North America, so indigenous art. So that's very exciting. That was another area that the Sainsbury's collected, and we've got these wonderful sort of indigenous works by artists from the northwest coast. So again, we're doing a similar thing there, where we're doing a very big exhibition that's going to really explore kind of historical works that are in sort of UK collections, so the Pitt Rivers, the British Museum, collections right across Britain actually. But then we're going to borrow quite a lot of contemporary art that kind of by indigenous artists in Canada that responds to that material. So it's going to be a very rich exhibition again, which looks at another sort of geographic region. But then after that, we're also relaunching the centre around this idea of sort of living art and sharing stories. So there's going to be a sort of big relaunch of the centre next spring.
Oh, wow. Well, as if you haven't got enough on your plate. I mean, I just find that fascinating, the idea that you're always thinking about what might be next, what you might be able to talk another gallery or somebody into loaning to you. And I imagine there's some sort of reciprocal arrangement sometimes. There must be a lot of negotiating going on. But then the excitement of actually having something shipped to you and actually having it delivered, that must be wonderful.
Well, Anne, it's the best bit. It's the best bit. I mean, actually, the installation is the bit that I enjoy the most. And in fact, we're in it right now. So as soon as I finish this interview, I'll be back into the galleries to see what other wonderful things are being unpacked in there. Yeah. But yes, that's when it all makes sense and it all comes together. And then you see these objects. I mean, most of the time you will have seen them. We try and see objects rather than just borrowing things. But of course, there will have been the things that we haven't been able to see. They've been in a foreign country and we haven't been able to get there to look at them. So, you're always immensely relieved when you open the crate and, it's a marvellous object. So, yes, it's so exciting. I mean, that's the sort of best bit, really. That's the best bit.
Does your job take you to other museums around the world?
It does. Yes, it does. And it has. In the past. I mean, I was lucky that I curated a number of exhibitions over many years that travelled internationally at the V&A. So my Art Deco exhibition travelled to America and to Japan. I did a show on surrealism and design, and that went to the Guggenheim and Bilbao. So you're travelling with the shows, but quite often you need to go to these countries to do the research as well. So if you're dealing with an international subject matter, you need to go and sort of find objects, talk to scholars, so there's a certain amount of that.
Do you have a favourite museum in the world?
I don't know if I could pick one. I have loads of favourites. I love Louisiana in Denmark, for instance. That's one of my favourite museums, and has a lot of sort of parallels with the Sainsbury Centre. But yes, no, I mean, I think if I had to pick one, it probably would be the Viking Ship Museum in Norway. And I'm not just saying that for Viking. I'm not. Literally, it is one of my favourite museums in the world because it is so simple. I mean, they're redesigning it now, so it's probably changing. But it's just a building with 3 sheds, and it's these 3 absolutely remarkable objects, 3 ships. And that's just so powerful. That was always, when I first visited that in the 90s, that was one of my, that's a very sort of visceral, powerful moment when you go into that museum and see those works. But yes, I'm thinking about it now. It's good that I've mentioned it in this interview.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you brought Viking back into the conversation. So let's just tell everybody you're also a godmother to a Viking river ship, aren't you?
I am. I was absolutely thrilled and rather taken aback to be invited to be a godmother of the Viking Fjorgen. And very sadly, I couldn't go to the launch because I got COVID. Well, my husband got COVID and then gave it to me, not to cast any blame. But yes, I was so very unfortunately I wasn't able to make it for the naming ceremony. But I was there on screen, and I'm really hoping to go on it later this year when we've opened the show and we've the show's open.
Yeah. I mean, of course, you bring up COVID, and in your business, inviting people in, wanting to show them around, give them an experience. It must have been a hellish couple of years.
It was really difficult. It was really difficult. But this is where the architecture of this building worked tremendously to our benefit, because, of course, we could put social distancing in place almost immediately. So we were one of the first museums in the country to reopen. In fact, I think we were the first to reopen after that first lockdown, because we were able very quickly to adapt the building so that we could operate social distancing. But it's been very tough for the whole sector, for all of us. I mean, audiences have been down. We've probably lost 25% of our audience since COVID. We're really hoping they come back, and we hope that Visions of Ancient Egypt will encourage people to come back with this unique sort of groundbreaking show. But it's been very, very difficult. It's been very difficult.
Well, you're doing the right things to get things going again. I'd be there like a shot. So the Visions of Egypt open this month now, right through to the end of January, and that's in the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich. And as you said, if people can't get to see it, it tours elsewhere. But let's hope they come to you. Put your
I think it opens to the 8th of January, so not the end. The beginning, sort of the beginning. But yes, but it goes on to Newcastle. Yeah, so.
It's great to talk to you about it. You have the most fantastic job. You really do. I hope you know that.
Oh, well, I know. I am thankful all the time, actually.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. And good luck with what your next projects. And let's hope we can talk to you about those as well.
Yes. Well, thank you, Anne. And
Elaine.
thank you to Viking. And so lovely to be in the Viking family.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Well, next week here on Viking TV, it's going to be Fashion Week, and my guest will be Peter Nyan, who's the founder of PDN. It's a shirt and shirt dress band, which, by the way, you can now buy on board Viking ocean ships. Well, just in case our talk of all things ancient Egyptian has sparked your curiosity for a bit of exploration, here's what you could see for yourself on board the Viking Osiris. Take it from me, the only downside to going there once is that you're going to want to go back again and again. Until I'm with you next week, do stay safe and well, and enjoy planning your next holiday, because that's exactly what I'm going to do. Bye.
On this intriguing 12-day itinerary, you can immerse yourself in ancient secrets, long buried in desert sands, while enjoying the welcoming culture of Egypt as you explore with Viking. Your journey begins with a 3-night stay in Cairo, the cradle of civilization, during which you can gaze upon the world's oldest step pyramid at Saqqara, the Great Pyramids, the stunning Sphinx, and enjoy Cairo's Museum of Egyptian Antiquities. You'll also have ample time to check out the city on your own. Luxor is next, unfolding before you for 2 amazing days. Satisfy your curiosity at the great temples of Luxor and Karnak and the remarkable Valley of the Kings. Here you'll enjoy privileged access to the tomb of Queen Nefertiri, an exquisitely preserved site only a few visitors have the chance to see. In Cana, discover the sprawling complex of Dendera and its fascinating Temple of Hathor. Built by the Ptolemies and Romans in classic Egyptian style, it's one of Egypt's best preserved and less frequented temples. Isna is home to the red sandstone temple of Khnum, the 1st century hypostyle hall filled with intricately carved columns and detailed hieroglyphics. You'll sail on to Aswan and the serene Philae Sanctuary. This oasis was rescued from the rising waters of the Aswan Dam and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Or set out for Abu Simbel on an optional excursion to admire the great temple of Ramses II. A picturesque voyage along the Nile River brings you to Edfu, where you'll visit the Temple of Horus, the falcon god. It's one of Egypt's best preserved temples and an impressive remnant of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Your exotic Viking journey concludes back in Cairo, with free time to explore more of Egypt's intriguing culture.